All right. Welcome to Genesis class, and tonight we're going to cover chapters 16 through 19. So let's begin reading verses 1 through 6 of chapter 16. Okay, Blake.
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And as he went into Hagar, she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarai said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her.
Okay, so some time has passed, and Sarai is obviously feeling the pressure of nothing's happening here, you know. We're going to learn later that they've been in the land for 10 years. When we get to the end of the chapter, we have Abram's age being given to us, so we know how long they've been in the land at this point. So she's feeling the pressure and deciding that it's not going to happen physically through her. So what's the deal with this plan of giving Abram her maidservant Hagar to birth a baby? How will this be Sarai's baby? You guys know anything about customs in the ancient Near East, for instance? That would be a no, huh? Okay. Well, let me suggest to you that what Abram and Sarai are doing is they are following acceptable cultural practice of their day. Here's a quote from Genesis commentary. "The mistress could then feel that her maid's child was her own and exert some control over it in a way that she could not if her husband simply took another wife." So it wasn't unusual for an infertile couple for the male to be given another wife. And if it was a slave of his wife, then the wife had control over her. Whereas if the husband just went out and married someone else, then that first wife would have absolutely no control. So Sarai at this point believes apparently that this is her only option. And so she makes this proposal to Abram, and he agrees to it. And sure enough, it's successful. Hagar gets pregnant, but what happens after that?
Contempt between Hagar and Sarah.
Yeah, a little bit of looking down her nose at her mistress because she's able to do something that her mistress is not, right? Let me ask you another question. Where do you suppose that Abram and Sarah got Hagar from? Oh, from Egypt, because she is an Egyptian, right? So here's another problem with that trip down to Egypt. This may never have happened had they not taken that trip down there, unless Sarah had proposed some other maidservant of hers to Abram. So this just sort of adds to the story back in chapter 12 and the mistake that was made by them going down into Egypt. Now, the phrasing here is very interesting because we can't be too hard on Sarah. After all, at this point, she's 75 years old, and they've been in the land 10 years, and she hasn't been able to conceive, okay? And it is a culturally acceptable practice to do this, and in her mind, she may be thinking, just as sometimes we do, well, maybe this is the Lord's way of accomplishing this, you know. It hasn't happened the way I thought it would. Maybe it's this way. But of course, this is going to cause all kinds of problems. Again, 2 wives is never a good idea, and the scripture shows that in every single instance where a husband has more than 1 wife. And right away, there's problems. As soon as Hagar becomes pregnant, there is friction and jealousy between Sarai and Hagar. Some of the phrases here remind us of an earlier story. Surprise, surprise, huh? We see that a lot. The phrases, Abram listened to the voice of his wife, and Sarai took and gave her to Abram, echoes the sin in Edom. This is what Adam did. Listen to the voice of his wife, and then Eve took of the fruit and gave it to him to eat. So, and then the consequences that happened in the garden, we have consequences here of the act. It doesn't turn out the way everyone hopes that it will. Instead, it creates friction and jealousy between them. And what do you think of Sarai's response in verse 5? My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me.
But she's definitely regretting her decision.
Yeah, that's clear. And why is she blaming Abram?
He didn't really seem to fight back too much.
No, he didn't, did he?
That option.
Yeah, and again, there's a similarity with Adam. There was no fight there that's recorded. He was very passive and just accepted the fruit. And here, Abram accepts what Sarai proposes and takes Hagar. So she may be angry at him because he didn't assert more leadership and say, no, this isn't the way. We need to wait on the Lord or something like that. Or there may be something that we're just not being told in the text. But this also reminds me of the story of the sin in the Garden of Eden, because remember that after Eve and Adam sinned, Adam blamed Eve and Eve blamed the serpent. And it caused problems, obviously, in the relationship between Adam and Eve. And here we have Sarai blaming Abram for the problem, and it causing problems in their relationship. But Abram surrenders here in verse 6, says, she's your maid, you do as you please with her. And we see that Sarai is not very nice. Says she dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her presence. Guess what? This statement actually looks forward. It's a foreshadowing of some things that are later said in the Exodus story. So Sarah represents Israel here, or Sarai, and she afflicts Hagar, who is an Egyptian. Later, Egypt will afflict Israel, and it's the same Hebrew word being used in both stories. And then Hagar flees, just as Israel will later flee from Egypt, again, using the same Hebrew word. So once again, we have a foreshadowing. So this story is interesting. It looks back. It has typological similarities to the sin in the garden, but it also foreshadows something that's going to happen in the history of Israel, but opposite, right? Instead of Israel afflicting Egypt and Egypt fleeing, it will be the other way around. Now, I have a personal story that I just wanted to share with you guys along these lines. Gloria and I were never able to have children. And so we tried for many years, and we went to the doctors on numerous occasions, and we tried various options that modern science and technology offers for a couple to be able to get pregnant, and nothing happened. So we reached a point where there were more decisions that could have been made, but to make those decisions, in our opinion, involved moral choices we weren't willing to make. And we got to the point where we felt like, God is a big enough God that if he wants us to have a child, we'll have a child. And then we also thought maybe he wants us to adopt. So we started pursuing the adoption route. And for whatever reason, that never worked out. But one thing that, as sad as it's been for Gloria and I to never have children, and now at our age, of course, no grandchildren, it's very sad. But we're confident that for whatever reason that we don't understand, it was the Lord's will for our life. And we're grateful we chose that path. And the lesson that I want to share with you guys is culture sometimes offers many acceptable ways to accomplish something. But what we always need to do is weigh what culture says with what the Word of God says and what our conscience is telling us about the Word of God. And we need to make our decision based on that, not based on, well, everybody else is doing it, so, why shouldn't we do it? That's no judgment on anyone who has pursued fertility plans that Gloria and I didn't want to pursue, because that's their choice between them and the Lord. But Gloria and I knew it would be a violation of what our consciences felt to go any further. Now, a happy ending would be they honored the Lord and the Lord blessed them with a child, either, through physical birth or through adoption. But hey, that's not our story. Our story is no, the Lord gave us no children. Okay, so when you make a decision that you believe is what the Lord wants you to make, you can't make it in a way where you think, maybe deep down in your heart, and maybe I can manipulate God because I'll show him that I'm faithful and he'll have to do this for me. No, you stay faithful to the Lord, and then whatever the Lord's will is, you accept it. If he decides to bless you with this thing, great. But if he decides to withhold it from you, then you just have to say, Lord, you're God, and your ways are higher than mine. You are wiser than I am. So in this case, we can sympathize with Sarai and Abram because the culture said it's okay to do this, to get a child. And, they've been waiting a long time for a child and it hasn't happened. And so it's easy to begin to rationalize, hey, culture says that it can be done this way. Maybe this is God's way of doing it. But sadly, as we see, it's not God's way, because the story here is compared to the sin in the Garden of Eden, and it creates future problems as well as immediate problems within the family. So any thoughts or questions on these first 6 verses? So it's an important lesson here, to be sure. And by the way, we're not so great that we don't always compromise with culture, but that's one instance that I just happen to think of every time I read this story, because Gloria and I were in a similar situation as the one described here. So in verses 7 through 14, we hear that Hagar has fled because Sarai treated her so badly. And we read here about her encounter with the angel of the Lord. So let's read Luke verses 7 through 14.
Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where do you come from? Where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. And the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. He shall be a wild man, his hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. And she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? Therefore the well was called Beer Lahairoi. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Bereh. Okay, thank you.
So Hagar is basically an escaped slave at this point, a runaway slave. And she has nowhere to go. And this story really is a surprising little story. It talks about God's concern for this young slave woman who's a foreigner, who's an Egyptian. And yet the Lord is looking out for her, and he's looking out for her child. The word angel of the Lord occurs 58 times in the Old Testament. And the phrase angel of God occurs another 11 times. So we see this expression frequently in the Old Testament. And one of the things that is interesting about the appearances of the angel of the Lord or the angel of God is that it, first of all, it's a physical manifestation, okay? And secondly, this one who's called an angel often speaks as if he is God himself. And sometimes within the same passage, we have the angel referring to himself as God, but also there's a reference to God in heaven. So this is very, very interesting because it suggests that even within the Old Testament, we have this idea of a Godhead, a manifestation of God in two different persons, right? The early church identified the angel of the Lord as the Logos, or as Jesus. In other words, pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. And personally, I agree with that. I didn't agree with the Melchizedek thing last night, but I do agree here that the angel of the Lord is a pre-incarnate appearance, the second person of the Trinity, simply because of the divine attributes attributed to this angel. And really, this prepares the way for understanding the New Testament and how God is manifest in three persons, as we see there, the Holy Spirit as well as the Father and the Son. So even within the Jewish scriptures, I'm told by one Bible scholar that the rabbis actually developed a doctrine of the two gods of the Old Testament. So even the Jewish rabbis saw this feature and were like, this is interesting because the angel is being manifested as God, and yet in the passage there's also a reference to God in heaven. So we have two manifestations of God in a passage. So any thoughts or questions on the angel of the Lord? Have you guys considered it the same way? Thought anyone had a different thought about who he was?
I think the Bible Project videos, they talked about this a bit.
They do.
I don't know if they said it was Jesus, but they said it could just be another representation of God, not in his full glory, but kind of like, not a puppet, but yeah. Something along those lines.
Yeah, I love the Bible Project videos. I think they do a good job at explaining the word Elohim that we were talking about last week and the heavenly council or the heavenly family of God, and this subject of the angel of the Lord too. So I'd encourage you to watch all their videos, but especially their videos dealing with these kinds of subjects we're talking about. I haven't assigned them to you guys because I figure you have enough work to do, but they're great videos, really good. Okay, so the angel of the Lord appears, and she is by a spring of water. And notice how he approaches her in verse 8. Where have you come from and where are you going? Reminds us of how the Lord approached Adam and Eve and how he approached Cain after his sin. He doesn't come condemning. He comes seeking to draw out from the person what the problem is and try then to bring a solution to the problem. So she's honest. She's fleeing from the presence of her mistress, Sarai. And here is something also surprising. Not only that the angel appeared to her, but now what he tells her to do. He doesn't say, there, Hagar, I understand. That was such a mean thing for your mistress to do. He says, go back to her. Yikes. Okay. Return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. Wow. There's a powerful lesson there. Sometimes God will tell us to do things that we don't want to do. But in his wisdom, they're for our best, even if the situation is very, very difficult for us. Okay, that's not an easy one to live out, but this text is a great example of that. How else would Hagar provide for herself and for this child that she's carrying? Now, the day will come, and we'll see it tomorrow night, when she is forced out of the family by Sarah. But for now, God says, this is where I want you to be. And to her credit, she is obedient and she returns. But the angel of the Lord gives her a great promise in verse 10. I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. Where have we heard that promise before? With Abraham, right? So Hagar is getting a very similar kind of promise. This is very gracious and generous of the Lord. And then the Lord goes on to explain who this child will be and what he wants him to be called. So behold, you're with child, you shall bear a son, you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. So what does the name Ishmael mean? Does anyone know? God hears. So there's a word play here. The Lord has heard your affliction. So Ishmael means God hears. And then verse 12 says he will be a wild man. The Hebrew actually says he'll be a wild donkey of a man. So this suggests that Ishmael is going to be quite an aggressive type of fellow. Some may describe him as a man's man or something like that. I don't know. But his hand will be against every man and every man's hand against him. It's not going to be an easy life, apparently, for Ishmael. He's going to be a very aggressive type of person. Now, the New King James says, he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Do any of you guys have a different translation there? He shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren.
I have over against all his kinsmen.
Yeah. So this is literally what the Hebrew phrase often means, is this idea of being against. So there's some dispute here as to whether the prophecy here means against or just means that this word can also mean like to be upon or something. So therefore in the presence of. So there's some question exactly how to interpret the Hebrew word here. But given the previous verses that his hand will be against every man and every man's hand against him, it seems to make sense to me to translate it, he shall dwell against all of his brethren. In other words, he's going to face a lot of opposition in his life. So Hagar is grateful. She is blown away that the Lord appears to her. And in verse 13, we have another one of these names for God in Genesis. She says, she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees. For she said, have I also here seen him who sees me? So I'm going to put up some of these names for God that we've seen to this point, and we're going to continue to encounter a few more. But remember, I told you guys that Genesis introduces us to a number of different names for God. And why did we suggest that happens? Do you remember?
And so we learn more about his character.
Yeah, it describes different aspects of who God is and his character. Now, she's to call her son Ishmael because God hears, but here she says, you're also a God who sees. So he's not just a God who hears, he's also a God who sees. Now, some of the names we've encountered so far, the name El Shaddai, which in English we often translate as God all-powerful. But the word Shaddai in Hebrew actually has a different meaning. So I'll just be blunt. It refers to female breasts. And so the idea is that this God is a God of fruitfulness or fertility. And when we get over to the next chapter, chapter 17, Abram's going to use this name, and it's going to be used in the context of fruitfulness and fertility. So we'll talk more about that when we get there. So we're not 100% sure what the best English translation is of this term, but it certainly conveys God's power, at least in the sense of God being a life-giving God, okay? Yesterday, when we looked at Melchizedek, we saw both he and Abram referring to God Most High. In Hebrew, this is the expression El Elyon. So notice in both of these we have El because El is the singular form for God. Elohim's plural, El is the singular. And then here in our story that we're looking at, the words are El Roi, God who sees. Sometimes we read this in English, it looks like Elroy. But I always tell people God's name is not Elroy. It's El Roi, God who sees. And so in verse 14, she goes on to name the well Be'er Lahai Roi. Be'er means well, Lahai means living, and Roi means who sees me. So the well of the one who sees me. Okay, anything else in these verses?
I've been told that the descendants of Ishmael is the nation of Islam. Do you think that's true, or who do you think these guys are?
It's part of what has become the nation of Islam. It's part of the Arab world. But as we'll see when we get to Genesis 25, Abram has another wife, and she gives birth to some peoples who also become part of the Arab people group. Okay? But yes, definitely Ishmael is a part of that. Okay, anything else? All right, let's finish the chapter here, verses 15 and 16, with the birth of Ishmael.
So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael.
Okay, so we'll learn a few things from these verses. If we subtract, we know Abram's going to be 100 years old when Isaac is born. So that tells us that we have a period of 14 years from the birth of Ishmael to the birth of Isaac. So again, when Isaac's finally born, Ishmael will be 14 years old. Abram is 86 here, which means he's been in the land now 11 years. So we give, 9 months for the pregnancy. That's why I said at the time that Sarai had this idea, they had been in the land for 10 years. And then Hagar gets pregnant and has the child, figuring 9 months plus the little bit of time for her to give Hagar to Abram and for Hagar to get pregnant. We're now looking at them being in the land for 11 years. One of the things said at the beginning of this chapter is that Sarai wanted to give her maid to Abram. Why? What was her motive in doing it? Yeah, so that she might have a son that belonged to her through her maid, right? But as we get to the end of the chapter, there's no mention of this son being related to Sarai in any way. The only people mentioned are Abram and Hagar. And both of them are mentioned 3 times in 2 verses. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram named his son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So 3 times we're told very strongly, this is Abram and Hagar's son. This is not Abram and Sarah's son. So this all suggests that the plan was a total failure in every way. It caused strife and problems in the family. It didn't turn out the way Sarah had hoped. So it's going to cause more problems as we proceed in the future. Okay, so that's chapter 16, unless you guys have anything else you want to chat about. Okay, so we move on to chapter 17. And in this chapter, we have God returning to Abram. We saw in chapter 15 how he spoke to him about establishing a covenant with him. And here God appears to him again to confirm this covenant. Notice as we begin the first verse, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram. We go from Abram being 86 in the previous verse to now he's 99. 13 years have passed by since this action with Hagar took place and they gave birth to Ishmael. And one wonders if God delayed fulfilling the promise just to demonstrate that he is the one who is absolutely in control and that human solutions just don't work. We can't say whether Abram and Sarai would have had a child a few years earlier or not, but it is interesting now that 13 years passed before the Lord once again speaks to Abram after this incident. Okay, so let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 8.
When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God, walk before me and be blameless. Now make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of many nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you in your generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your descendants after you. Also I give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God.
Okay, thank you. So God appears as El Shaddai, I am Almighty God. And he says to Abram, walk before me and be blameless. Where have we seen this expression of someone walking with God and being blameless? Noah, exactly. And again, we said there how, God bless you, blameless doesn't mean perfection, but it does mean a whole heart that is walking after God. And perhaps this is a bit of direction from God saying, you know, you haven't always walked before me and been blameless. So I'm coming to you now, and I'm calling you to follow me faithfully. And then verse 2, and I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly. Now we said that this term El Shaddai is connected with the idea of fruitfulness and fertility. And in fact, throughout the book of Genesis, when El Shaddai is mentioned, it is almost always, if not always, connected with fruitfulness. So there's a few other places where El Shaddai occurs, and in each of those verses, we have this command about being fruitful or multiplying, or both, be fruitful and multiply. Now, some people have argued that God makes two covenants with Abraham, because we have the covenant ceremony in chapter 15, and then we have God coming here saying, I will make my covenant between me and you. But this is not actually the case. God makes one covenant with Abraham. And one of the ways that I would argue that is, remember, God came to Noah twice and established a covenant with him, before the flood and after the flood. Yet we know that God only made one covenant with Noah. So the same thing is happening here. This is a confirmation of the earlier covenant that God had established with Abram. And here he's going to call on Abram both to walk before him and be blameless, and then he's also going to give him this covenant sign. And so where in 15, God did all the work by passing between the parts, here he's going to call on Abraham to respond and to be obedient to him. So he changes his name, right? We can finally stop calling him Abram, because we're so used to calling him Abraham. It seems like a nuisance to call him Abram, doesn't it? Because this becomes his new and permanent name. Interestingly enough, we know what Abram means. It means exalted father. Anytime you see the word AB attached to a name in Hebrew, AB is the word for father. It's Av in Hebrew. Okay, so we have a lot of AB names, and we'll come across more as we go through Genesis. So Av means father, and then Ram comes from a word to be exalted. So Avram or Abram means exalted father. But God changes his name here to Avraham, or Abraham as we call him. And we're not quite sure what the Raham means, but it's related to the word multitude. And so we think that there's a wordplay going on here, that God is telling Abram he's going to be the father of a multitude. He does go on to say, I'm going to make you the father of many nations. So clearly this is the significance behind the name Abraham. Abraham will now stand for a name that means a guy who's going to be the father of many nations. Now, this is interesting because earlier we had God promising Abram that he would make a great nation of him. And then we had God promising that he would have descendants like the dust of the earth and like the stars of the heavens. But here we're specifically being told that he'll be a father of not just one nation, but of many. And here's a guy who hasn't given birth to a single son yet. Well, I'm sorry, he's given birth to Ishmael, okay? But outside of Ishmael, he hasn't given birth to anyone else. So this is an extraordinary promise, isn't it? In verse 6, notice the fruitfulness again. I'll make you exceedingly fruitful. And I will make nations of you. And then this significant promise, and kings shall come forth from you. So this is the first explicit reference we have in Scripture of kings being part of the descendants of Abram. And this is all going to hook up with the promise of a seed to come who will bless all the nations. When we get to God making a covenant with David, it's very interesting. If you read 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God makes the covenant with David, he uses a lot of the same language that's used here in Genesis 17. And so there is an echo of the covenant with David going back to the covenant with Abraham. And it's in the covenant with Abraham that we're told kings shall come from you. And David is promised that he will have a seed who will sit upon his throne and rule over God's kingdom forever. Okay, so here is that messianic promise in its earliest form. Abram is going to be a father of many nations. Kings are going to come from him. One of those kings is ultimately going to be the Messiah. So he says in 7, this is an everlasting covenant to be God to you and your descendants after you. In the ancient world, when a man married a woman, what they would say, just like we have formulas today, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Do you take this husband to be this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? They had certain formulas too. And the formula that was frequently used is, I will be to you a husband, and you will be to me a wife. Well, listen to this formula. It's the same thing. I will be God to you and to your descendants after you. It's the marriage formula here. And so it's an expression that speaks of intimate relationship. And God here is promising that he will have an intimate relationship with Abram and his descendants, and that this is an everlasting covenant. And then in verse 8, he reiterates promises he's already made. I'll give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Okay, so we've seen some of these promises before. God is reiterating them, but he's also expanding on these promises in certain ways here. Okay, so any thoughts on these first 8 verses? Any questions?
I think it's really beautiful.
It is indeed.
The words used just does sound just like a marriage ceremony.
Yeah, yeah. Great. When I was in Bible college, I had a really great Genesis teacher, And it was the first time that I had ever really studied the Old Testament. And we came to this passage about God making a covenant with Abram. And my teacher explained it so well. I wish I could remember exactly how he explained it. But we came out of class, my friend and I, my best friend, and we were just like on cloud nine. And he said to me, Randy, he said, that class was like being born again. That's how impacted we were when we understood this God who desired a relationship with people and how he called Abraham into this intimate relationship. So I hear what you're saying there, Blake. I agree with it. Okay, we have a little more time before break, so let's see if we can get in these next few verses. Let's read 9 through 14.
Then God said to Abraham, your responsibility is to obey the terms of the covenant. You and all your descendants have this continual responsibility. This is the covenant that you and your descendants must keep. Each male among you must be circumcised. You must cut off the flesh of your foreskin as a sign of the covenant between me and you. From generation to generation, every male child must be circumcised on the 8th day after his birth. This applies not only to members of your family, but also to the servants born in your household and the foreign-born servants whom you have purchased. All must be circumcised. Your bodies will bear the mark of my everlasting covenant. Any male who fails to be circumcised will be cut off from the covenant family for breaking the covenant.
Okay, thank you. So in chapter 15, as we mentioned, God sort of did all the action at that point. He's the one that passed between the parts. But here he calls on Abram to keep a covenant sign, the sign of circumcision. Now, interesting question. Why in the world did God pick this? Any thoughts? Yeah.
I remember reading in the commentary of some kind that circumcision was like something the people of the time did, and it was God's way of like using something that was cultural norm and like
yeah, there's truth to that, Corinna. In fact, I'll put up a statement here on the slide in just a minute that Israel was not the only nation to practice circumcision in the ancient world, but God used this cultural act to have special significance for the Jews. Now, other nations would usually do it. Well, let me just put it all up here. And no, I can't do that yet because I want you to keep answering this question, why circumcision? So let me just stop short of what I'm going to tell you in a little bit and say you're absolutely right. And can anyone else expand on why circumcision?
Well, I can say what Dave said in our men's group.
Okay, can you say that?
No.
I don't know. Luke's shaking his head. Maybe we shouldn't go there. I don't know.
He said God knew where to put a reminder for men.
Okay. Well, there actually is truth to that.
He said a lot more than that, but that's the.
Yeah. One of the things that we've already noticed being emphasized here is that Abram is going to be the father of many nations, and God is going to make him fruitful and multiply. Well, how does that happen physically? Okay. All right. The man and the woman get together. So it is a reminder to the man that the seed is transmitted this way. And so it's a covenant made with God saying, yes, we will be fruitful and multiply. God is going to give us life. So it's a reminder that God is the giver of life and fruitfulness, and that Abram will be the father of many nations. Someone has also suggested that the permanence of the mark equals the lifelong commitment of the covenant. So that's kind of interesting. We do have this emphasis on this covenant being an everlasting covenant. So maybe this permanent mark also is a reminder of the permanence of the covenant. So to get to Corinna's point, other nations did indeed practice circumcision. But they did it differently. They did it as a coming of age ritual. So usually when the boy reached, puberty or age 13, he would go through this ritual. And you can see a list of some nations here in the ancient world that practiced circumcision: Egypt, Edom, Moab, and Ammon. And Jeremiah mentions this in Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 25 and 26. But here's a quote that gives you the difference between the way these nations practiced it and what God was calling Israel to do. This rite in Israel did not focus on human action that prepared men to father children, which is what it did in these other nations, but it emphasized God's covenant that promised fecundity and fertility to Israel. Long before an Israelite male was mature enough to father children, he would be circumcised and brought into the covenant that pledged many descendants to come. So as God says here to Abraham, that the child is to be circumcised when they are 8 days old, not when they're 13. Now, Ishmael is circumcised this day, and he's 13, but that's because God is just now instituting the covenant. But from here on out, every child born was to be circumcised at 8 days old. Okay. All right, great. Well, that makes it 10 minutes to 7, so we'll pause here, let you guys take a break, and we'll pick up here when you get back.
I always leave on great slides.
All right, well, not wanting to leave the ladies out of this covenant, now the Lord addresses Sarah and promises that are given to her. So, Eva, I think it's your turn to read, isn't it? Let's do 15 through 22.
Then Sarah said to Abram, "As for Sarah, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarah, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her and also give you a son by her, and I will bless her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be from her." Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his heart, "Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?" And Abraham said to God, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." Then God said, "No, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I have blessed him, and I will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly. He shall beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year." Then he finished talking with him, and God went up from Abraham.
Okay, so God specifically addresses Sarai. Now he does the same thing that he did with Abraham. He changes her name from Sarai to Sarah. They both mean the same thing. They both mean princess. So it's more the symbolic gesture of the change, suggesting her inclusion into the covenant than it is the changing of the meaning of her name. To this point, it could have been presumed that when God blessed Abram and said, "You're going to have a son," that it would be through Sarah, because at the time it was his only wife. But this is the first explicit mention by God that no, it's through Sarah that this promised son is going to come. So what's Abram's reaction to all this? He's like, "You got to be kidding me." And what's his reason for sort of his little incredulous laughter?
They're so old.
Yeah, okay.
Super old.
They're old. So Abraham, I keep calling him Abram, is nearly 100 years old, and Sarah is nearly 90 years old. And he's like, are we going to be able to give birth to a child together? And he's had 13 years now with Ishmael. And in verse 18, he says, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." So you can see his heart for Ishmael. But man's plans aren't always God's plans, right? And God says, "No, Sarah, your wife, will bear you a son. And you shall call his name Isaac." Does anyone know what Isaac means? Exactly. So we've got Abraham laughing, and God says, "Okay, I've got the perfect name for your child." Okay, we're going to call him Laughter. But God doesn't ignore Abraham's prayer and request for Ishmael. He says, "As for Ishmael," verse 20, "I've heard you. Behold, I have blessed him and will make him fruitful and will multiply him exceedingly." Wow. Okay, there's some of our key Genesis words. I will bless him, make him fruitful, and multiply him. So perhaps Abram and Sarai made a mistake back in chapter 16, rushing ahead of God. But God is still incredibly gracious, and he's going to take this son, Ishmael, and he says, "I'm going to bless him and make him fruitful." And he says he'll beget 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. What's this idea of 12 princes remind you of?
The 12 tribes.
Yeah, very similar. And it's not the last time we'll see this number 12 connected with descendants related to Abraham. So this is a great and gracious blessing by the Lord on Ishmael. Now, if we go back to Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, when God called Abram and he gave him this list of blessings, what was the last promise, the last blessing in that list?
The families of the earth shall be blessed.
Families of the earth shall be blessed in you, right? So God is going to bless Ishmael because of his association with Abraham. Abraham is to be the mediator of blessing to all the nations of the world. So that includes all the nations. That even includes Ishmael. And as we go through Genesis, one of the interesting things that we're going to notice is that Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, and then later Joseph, actually touch and bless all of the nations of the ancient Near East, all of the nations that surround the land of Canaan. So although the ultimate fulfillment of this promise is clearly Jesus in the New Testament, even in the book of Genesis, we begin to see God at work using Abraham and his family to bless all the nations of the earth. Okay, so we'll keep track of that as we go through Genesis. But in verse 21, God says, "My covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this set time next year." Now, I skipped over one thing that I wanted to point out, and that's back in in the same chapter, but back in verse 16, where God told Abram that Sarah will be a mother of nations, kings of peoples shall be from her. So the very same promise that was given to Abram, that he'd be a father of nations and that kings would come from him, he says that same promise applies to Sarah as well. So the promised seed is clearly then going to come through Abraham and Sarah and their offspring Isaac. Okay, and then verse 22 tells us that he finished talking with him and God went up from Abram. So this was some sort of vision or something, and God came down on Abraham and had this revelation that he gave to him. Anything in these verses you want to chat about?
I do like that God didn't get mad at Abraham's reaction. God was talking to him and he started laughing in his face.
Yeah.
He said, so he took it very well.
He did. He says that he's patient, and indeed, we see it here.
We get to see another attribute of God right there.
Yeah, exactly. From this point on, Abraham doesn't seem to waver in believing that God will give him a son through Sarah. And Paul sort of picks up on this in Romans 4 and talks about how Abram grew stronger in his faith, giving glory to God because he believed that God could even use the deadness of this old couple to bring life into the world. Okay, great. Well, let's conclude the chapter. What we see in the coming verses here is Abraham's obedience to everything that God commanded him to do. Back to you, Blake. Yeah.
Then Abraham took Ishmael his son, and all those born in his house, or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house. And he circumcised the flesh of their foreskin that very day, as God had said to him. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. That very day, Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. And all the men of his house, those born in the house, and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him.
Okay. So we know for sure, huh?
So many circumcisions.
So many circumcisions.
So many foreskins.
This is the way that Scripture often emphasizes obedience, through this repetition that's going on. It says from that very day, on that very day, Abram did this. Notice that it not only includes Abram doing it himself, but all of the men who were in his house. And this, of course, also includes Ishmael, who was, we're told, 13 at this time. So all of these people who are associated with Abraham become incorporated into the family and into the covenant with Abraham. I don't know if you guys know this, and I've only been told this. I haven't experienced it myself, but I'm told that it's better to get circumcised when you're born than it is when you're older, because it's a very, very painful procedure for a guy. So we're actually going to see evidence of that when we get to Genesis 34. It incapacitates a whole city. So for Abraham at 99 to get circumcised, like, wow, that's obedience.
To hear that conversation with his household.
Yeah, guess what we're going to do today, guys?
Bring in the farmers and the riggers. We got a fun project.
Right. And I like the emphasis in verse 27 that, I've already pointed this out, but it says, all the men of his house, born in the house or bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. So it purposely lets us know that foreigners were brought in to this covenant with Abraham. So already we see Gentiles being added into the family of Abraham. That's a little bit anachronistic to use that term, but I think that's the emphasis here, that everyone is to be included and accepted into Abraham's family. Okay. I'm finished with chapter 17 if you are. You ready to move on? Okay, a little introductory thing here as we begin to look at chapters 18 and 19. And the reason I put them together is because these chapters are a unit. Remember how back in Genesis chapter 2 and 3, we said this is really a unit or one long story. Well, here it's several stories, but they all fit together. They share a lot of similarities in language. And what happens here is that these two chapters compare and contrast the two main participants, which are Abraham and Lot. So we return later in the chapter to hear about Lot being in Sodom. And actually, we hear about Sodom, and then in chapter 19, it focuses on Lot being in Sodom. In chapter 18, the focus is on Abraham and this divine visit that he has from the Lord. Okay, so we're going to look at these two chapters as a whole. Let's start by reading verses 1 through 8.
Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran through the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground, and said, My Lord, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant. Please let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Now you bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servant. They said, Do as you have said. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, Quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cake. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as he ate.
Okay, so we're told here at the beginning of chapter 18 that the Lord appeared to him. So we know that amongst these 3 visitors, one of them is the Lord. Abraham doesn't know this at the very beginning. And this is where we get the statement in Hebrews that we are to be hospitable because thereby some have entertained angels unaware. It's going to become clear to Abraham that his visitors include the Lord, but at this point, he's just practicing ancient Near Eastern hospitality. This is what you were to do if you encountered strangers. You were to take them in, feed them, refresh them, so that they could then go on their way. And even today, if you go to the Middle East, people are extremely hospitable there. They feel it's their obligation to look after you. So it's a great practice. But we see it here in Abraham. So he's sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So it's sometime here in the afternoon, hottest part of the day. And he looks up and he sees these 3 men. And what is it that Abraham does when he sees them? He runs to them. He shows them great courtesy, right? He bows himself to the ground and says, If I found favor in your sight, don't pass by your servant. So very polite and humble language to them. And then he offers them hospitality in verse 4. Let a little water be brought and wash your feet. So in the ancient world where people are walking everywhere, obviously the feet get dirtied. And one of the kindnesses that a host would always provide for a guest is some water so that they could wash their feet. And then he says in verse 5, I'll bring you a morsel of bread that you may refresh your hearts. Well, Abraham prepares much more than a morsel of bread, as we see. The writer goes on to give this elaborate description of this feast that Abraham prepares for them. And notice the language that's used of Abraham, verse 6. So Abraham hurried into the tent, and he says to Sarah, quickly make 3 measures of fine meal. In verse 7, and Abraham ran to the herd and took a tender and good calf and gave it to the young men, and he hastened to prepare it. So there's all this rushing about and extravagance and fixing a really beautiful meal. And this guy's 99 years old, and it's the heat of the day, and he's running all over the place to take care of these guests or visitors. So it's a good witness of the type of person that Abraham is. And we're going to see a reflection of this in a later descendant. So when we get to that chapter, we'll recall this story. So anything else here in these verses? Now, of course, the purpose is that God has come to share the news of a son in person. And in the process, he's going to share in this meal with Abraham. And in the ancient world, eating together was an important way of demonstrating relationship. Okay, so just as we share the Lord's Supper and we believe that the Lord is present and we commune with him, so Abram here is feeding the Lord, and these two angels, as we'll find out, they're angels who are with the Lord. Okay, all right, so let's read verses 9 through 15.
"Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he said. Then one of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" Then the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord?' I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh."
Okay. So God had already spoken to Abraham that he was going to have a son through Sarah, and they were to name him Isaac. If Abraham communicated this to Sarah, she only had his word to go on. And we can see here she's even skeptical when she hears it from these strangers, maybe not realizing at that point who they are. But the Lord is gracious to come and actually speak it so that she can overhear it and come to faith that it is something that he's going to bring about. So God speaks knowing that she's listening at the door of the tent. And this is the first indication, I think, that these are more than just strangers that have showed up, because the Lord says, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" in verse 9. It'd be like, wait a minute, how do you know my wife's name? And then he goes on to say, "I will certainly return to you according to the time of life, and behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." At this point, Abram knows who the visitor is, because this is the same thing that God had just promised him in the previous chapter. And God is showing this extra knowledge that a human being wouldn't have. Verse 11, our author chimes in. He says, as if we needed this reminder. Now, Abram and Sarah were old, well advanced in age. And Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. This is the most interesting comment. We knew she was old, but here we're being told she was past the age of childbearing. In other words, her periods had stopped. So humanly speaking, there was absolutely no way that this woman could have a child. No wonder she found it hard to believe when she overhears, this time next year, Sarah will have a son. And might be why Abraham laughed too in chapter 18. He would have known. So that's a very important verse. And we're not surprised then in verse 12. So Sarah laughed and says, "After I've grown old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also." So not only am I old, he's old. And 13 again shows the divine knowledge of the Lord. Why did Sarah laugh? Because she's in the tent laughing to herself, presumably fairly quietly. And yet God knows what's going on. And so it's sort of a little rebuke here. Is anything too hard for the Lord? So this is really the key to the story, I think. This is one of those key verses that jumps out at you. This is what the story is wanting to communicate. Things may seem impossible from a human point of view, but is anything too difficult for the Lord? Is anything impossible for the Lord? And that's what the Lord wants to teach both Abraham and Sarah, that they can trust him, that he is the Lord of life, and that he can bring life out of a dead womb. So Sarah now realizes that this is the Lord that's visited, and Abraham confronts her, and she denies it and says, "I did not laugh." And it says, "For she was afraid." But he said, now we don't know if this is the Lord or Abraham speaking. He said, "No, but you did laugh." But this is a fun little exchange that's going on here, right? Because we recall that the word laugh is the word Isaac. So we're being told in chapter 17 that Abraham Isaaced when the Lord told him he was going to have a son through Sarah. And now we're told here that Sarah Isaaced. And she's asked, why did you Isaac? And she says, I didn't Isaac. And so, we're having a good Isaac here with this story. It's a fun little story about this idea of this child who's going to be named Laughter. And God is going to turn this laughter of unbelief into a laughter of joy when we get to chapter 21. He can do that for all of us. And I think that's one of the points of the story. Is anything too hard for the Lord? It seems impossible to us. But he can take our skeptical laughter and he can turn it into the laughter of joy by doing something we never dreamed possible. Okay, any other thoughts or comments on this part of the story? We shift gears here now to Abram walking off with the Lord and these two angels as the Lord tells him about his plan to bring judgment on Sodom. So a big long passage here. Whose turn to read? Okay, Skylar, do you and Kristen kind of want to split this one up? It's about 17 verses, so one of you could take 8 verses and the other one could take, 9 verses?
I'll just read it. 25.
Okay, you're going to read 16 to 25. Okay.
Then the man rose from there and moved towards Sodom, and Abraham went with him to send them on their way. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am giving, since Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they may keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. And the Lord said, Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very great, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it that has come to me, and if not, I will know. Then the men turned away from there and went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. And Abraham came near and said, Would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there were 50 righteous within the city. Would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous should be as the wicked. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?
And the Lord replied, If I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will spare the entire city for their sake. And Abraham spoke again, Since I have begun, let me speak further to my Lord, even though I am but dust and ashes. Suppose there are only 45 righteous people rather than 50. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And the Lord said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 righteous people there. And Abraham pressed his request further. Suppose there are only 40. And the Lord replied, I will not destroy it for the sake of 40. Please don't be angry, my Lord, Abraham pleaded. Let me speak. Suppose only 30 righteous people are found. And the Lord replied, I will not destroy it if I find 30. And Abraham said, Since I have dared to speak to the Lord, let me continue. Suppose there are only 20. And the Lord replied, Then I will not destroy it for the sake of the 20. Finally, Abraham said, Lord, please don't be angry with me if I speak one more time. Suppose only 10 are found there. And the Lord replied, Then I will not destroy it for the sake of the 10. When the Lord had finished his conversation with Abraham, he went on his way, and Abraham returned to his tent.
Okay, thank you guys. So backing up to verse 16, following the meal, it says the men rose from there and looked towards Sodom. And Abraham went with them to send them on their way. Now I like verse 17 because this is so like the Lord. He invites Abraham into this conversation by saying, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am doing? In other words, I don't want to hide it from you, Abraham. I want you to participate in this conversation with me. He's basically inviting Abraham to hear his plans and then to allow Abraham to intercede on behalf of the city. So this is great mercy on the Lord's part. And he reconfirms a number of the promises that he made to Abraham here in verses 18 and 19. He says, Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. So there's that Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3, how Abraham was going to be a great nation and how he was going to bless all the nations of the earth. So God's saying, you're going to be a great nation. You're going to bless all the nations of the earth. Well, I'm about to judge these cities. So I'm inviting you to have this conversation with me as to whether it is just or not to destroy these cities. And here is Abram's opportunity to be a blessing to these cities through his intercession. So I like verse 19. What the Lord says here is very important. He says, for I have known him, speaking of Abraham. And why has Abraham been known by God? In order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice. Why does the Lord know any of us? It's so that we can walk in the ways of the Lord, but more than that, so that we can command our children to walk after the Lord. I think, as I shared with you guys earlier in the class, I've never been a parent, but I always have thought that one of the important things that parents should do, and I speak to you guys who probably most, if not all of you, will be parents in the future, don't only raise your kids in the Lord, but raise your kids to teach their kids to know the Lord. This is a generational thing. And there's nothing more beautiful than to see a family history of people that have followed the Lord for generation after generation. We had an Israeli student here the last couple of semesters, and her family is the 5th generation Messianic believers in Israel. That's quite a legacy, quite a heritage, And I was watching the prayer day at Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago that was led by Franklin Graham. And I looked at the family of Billy Graham and how faithful not just Billy Graham was and his children are, but his grandchildren now are picking up the mantle. And this is what God's saying here. It's important not only that you walk blameless before me, but that you command your children to walk in the ways of the Lord as well, and to do righteousness. And sadly, that's what some of my generation failed to do. They sort of dropped the ball and didn't really live out the gospel before their kids. Now, some of you have parents who've done that, and some of you have parents that were unbelievers, and you've come to know the Lord through his grace. But the charge is there for us to not forget it's not just about our salvation, but it's about reaching others, and it's about reaching the next generation. Okay, that's my little sermon. Have you got any thoughts? I just think that's a very important verse 19. Okay, so in verse 20, God explains to him that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great because their sin is very grave. Now, that's not a surprise to us, because back in chapter 13, we were told that the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked. Okay, so we know that. But what is this? In verse 21, it says, God says, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry against it. Does God need to physically go down to Sodom to see if it's really as bad as he thinks it is? So what's that language communicating?
Like his mercy, like he's going to be 100% sure, even though he is, he's like showing us that he's going even the extra mile.
Right, God's going the extra mile. It's an emphasis of his grace and his mercy, so that if judgment falls, there'll be absolutely no excuse. No one can say God was unfair in doing this, right? So God says these things, which obviously then is an invitation to Abraham to respond to him, which Abraham begins to do in verse 23. And we have this very famous prayer of Abraham where he sort of bargains God down from 50 righteous all the way down to 10, right? And I can't help but wonder if there's a little smile on God's face while Abraham's doing this, because this must please the heart of God, that his servant has such a heart for people that he doesn't want to see a city destroyed if there's even 10 righteous in the city. And clearly this is God's heart. He's invited Abraham to speak back to him, and he's allowed Abraham to go down to 10 people. And even though there aren't 10 righteous, God still saves Lot and his family, doesn't he? So it's God's heart to want to show mercy and to want to show grace. But sin at some point has to experience judgment. Sin produces death, and sin cries out for justice to be done. And that's what God's saying here. The outcry from Sodom has been great. In other words, this word outcry in Hebrew has to do with there being a lot of injustice going on. And so if God is a just God, he cannot let situations just go on and on and on that are unjust. I like Abraham's demeanor in the prayer too. He's always like, Lord, if I could just, one more time, please don't be angry with me. So he's very humble and gracious about the way he approaches God. He's not demanding anything here. He is simply interceding in a humble way for the people of Sodom. And it finishes in verse 33. It says, the Lord went his way when he had finished speaking with Abraham, and Abraham returned to his place, which sets us up now for the story in chapter 19. Okay? Anything else that you want to talk about in chapter 18 or in this prayer of Abraham? Okay. Before we get into chapter 19, let me throw a little diagram up here for you. Notice that chapter 19, well, actually beginning with chapter 18, verse 16, where Abraham starts to have this conversation with the Lord, that this whole story can be laid out in a chiastic structure. And that the middle of the chiasm is where the destruction of Sodom is announced in chapter 19, verses 12 through 13. And at that point, the story becomes a mirror image of itself. Okay? So I don't show you this with every story in Genesis, but you've seen me do it with several, because I just want to keep in the forefront of your mind how beautifully written these stories are to communicate the spiritual truths that they communicate. The Lord is a master communicator. His word is what gives us life. His word is what brought the creation into existence. And the Lord is a wordsmith. He knows how to use words to communicate his truth. And I think that we as his children should take seriously trying to learn our best to communicate God's truth to others. We should be people who, to the best of our ability, and we're all different, but learn to read well, learn to write well, learn to speak well, so that we can communicate God's word as effectively as possible. Ultimately, it depends on the Holy Spirit working through us. We're not going to convert anybody, are we? Or teach anybody in our own strength. But nonetheless, we should hone all of the skills and gifts that God gives us and be the best instrument that we can be in his hands. And that's one of the things that I keep being impressed with as I read through Genesis, how beautifully written it is and how powerfully it communicates God's word. Okay, so to get into the story of Sodom, let's read verses 1 through 11.
Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them, and he bowed himself to his face toward the ground. And he said, "Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." And they said, "No, but we will spend the night in the open square." But he insisted strongly. So they turned in to him and entered his house. Then he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Now before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both old and young, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. And they called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them carnally." So Lot went out to them through the doorway, shut the door behind him, and said, "Please, my brethren, do not do so wickedly. See now, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do to them as you wish. Only do nothing to these men, since this is the reason they have come under the shadow of my roof." And they said, "Stand back." Then they said, "This one came in to stay here, and he keeps acting as a judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." So they pressed hard against the men Lot and came near to break down the door. But the men reached out their hands and pulled Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they became weary trying to find the door.
Okay, thank you. So we're told in verse 1 that the two angels came to Sodom in the evening. So we finally get the identity of who the other two with the Lord were, that they were angels. And they arrive at the gate of Sodom, and Lot is sitting in the gate. What does that suggest? Lot is sitting in the gate.
Doesn't that usually mean they're important?
Exactly. Usually they're like an elder, recognized, respected in the city, and that's what it means to sit in the gate. We looked at a picture of Tel Dan yesterday of the gate that dates from the time of Abraham. Blake, you've been to Tel Dan. If you remember, when you go into the other gate, there's a series of benches there just inside the wall. And this is where both the king and elders would sit to make judgments in the city. So court cases or whatever be brought to the gate, and the elders would sit there and make judgments. So Lot is here sitting in the gate, and so the idea is that he is a prominent figure in Sodom. Now this is really interesting, because this is a guy who back in chapter 13 was looking down at the plain and saying, "Oh, that looks like the garden of the Lord and like the land of Egypt. That's where I want to live." And it said he pitched his tent towards Sodom. But later we find him living in Sodom, and not just living as a citizen, but being a leading citizen within the city. Although we're going to see a lot of people resent him here, don't they, as we get a little further into the story. So he's in the gate when these angels arrive. And here we start to see a lot of interesting similarities between when Abraham met the three visitors and now as Lot meets the two angels. So we can sort of compare and contrast Lot and Abraham's actions. Both are sitting and both bow to their guests as they arrive. Both offer their home and to wash the feet of their guests. Lot says in verse 2, "Hear now, my lords, please turn into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." What is their response to Lot's invitation to stay at his house? Yeah, no, but we'll spend the night in the open square, right? Lot doesn't stop, does he? What does he say? Or what does the text say? Verse 3. Yeah, my version says he insisted strongly. I think Lot knows what a dangerous city this is for strangers to come sitting in the open square and trying to spend the night there. They'd get in a lot of trouble. And so Lot is protective here. So this is a good quality of Lot. He wants to protect these strangers and he wants to show them hospitality. Abraham offers bread, and we're told that Lot offers unleavened bread, maybe because of the lateness of the hour. And so he's going to prepare a quick meal for these strangers. But again, Lot's showing hospitality, similarly to the way that Abraham did. Now, along these lines, it said Abraham said that he would bring a morsel and he prepares a feast, whereas Lot is said to make them a feast, but only unleavened bread is mentioned. So it's a funny little contrast. It may be that, I presume that Lot offered them more than unleavened bread, but nonetheless, the contrast in the story is there, and it's kind of humorous. Another similarity, well, actually, this is a contrast. Abram's tent is a place of safety, but Lot's house is a place of danger. So it was Lot's decision to move to Sodom. And Lot has now put himself, his family, and anyone who comes under his roof in danger by the choice that he has made. So in verse 4, we're told that before they laid down, the men of the city, both old and young, so people of all ages, and it's emphasized, all the people from every quarter surrounded the house. So this shows the corruption of the entire city. Everybody's turning out here, and their purpose is not to say, hi, we want to welcome you foreigners, but rather it's to abuse and to shame these foreigners. And they say, who are the men who came with you tonight? Bring them out that we may know them. Okay? We all understand what that means, right? Now, there have been some people these days who've tried to argue that they are not saying that they want to have sexual relations with them. But this is really just political correctness trying to argue this point. Because it's very clear in the story, Lot offers his daughters to them, and he says they have not known a man, using the same word, meaning they haven't had sexual relations with a man. So he offers his own daughters. So when they say, bring the men out that we may know them, what they want to do is have a homosexual relationship with these angels. They basically want to gang rape them. So we see the brutality of the city of Sodom here being evidenced in this scene. And Lot pleads with them, right? It's very brave of Lot. He goes outside the door and shuts the door behind him and pleads with them not to do this. So we can admire that, but then he goes on to offer his daughters. Okay, not so good. This may suggest that Lot is being infected a little bit by Sodom, or maybe it's just a situation where, when we get ourselves in a very bad situation, sometimes there's no good choice to make. And because hospitality was such an important thing in the ancient world, you wouldn't let anything harm your guests. You would protect them at all costs. So Lot is saying, okay, this is a horrible situation, but I can't let anything happen to my guests. So I'll offer them the other most precious thing I have. I'll offer them my daughters, okay? Well, it's an abominable thing for him to do, but at the same time, he's put himself in a position where there's no good choice to make, okay? And of course, the men reject it, and they're ready to attack Lot. And it's the angels that save him and grab him and draw him back into the house. And then what do the angels do?
They struck him with blindness.
Yes, they strike the men of the city with blindness. This word is only used one other place. It's used in the story of Elisha when a foreign army comes to want to destroy Israel. And Elisha blinds them all and leads them to the king of Israel as captives. And so the idea here is of a bright light that blinds you. And it does not mean that these guys are permanently blinded, but the flash of light is so brilliant that they can't see for a period of time. So the angels blind all the men, and it says they were weary looking for the door. At this point now, we're going to see that the angels have made up their mind. The city's going to be destroyed. Lot, you and your family need to get out of here. So is there anything in these verses that you have a question about or that jumps out to you that you want to chat about before we move on? Okay, well, why don't we pause here then, because it's time for our final break. And when we come back, we'll pick up here. So in verses 12 through 22, we read about the coming judgment and then about Lot's deliverance. So let's see, whose turn to read? Okay, 12 to 22.
Then the men said to Lot, "Have you anyone else here? Sons-in-laws, daughters, or anyone you have in the city? Bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord. And the Lord has sent us to destroy it." So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-laws who were to marry his daughters, "Up, get out of this place. The Lord is about to destroy the city." But he seemed to his sons-in-laws to be jesting. As morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be swept away in the punishment of the city." But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to them, and they brought him out and set him outside of the city. And as they brought them out, one said, "Escape for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Escape to the hills, lest you be swept away." And Lot said to them, "Oh no, my lords. Behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot escape to the hills, lest a disaster overtake me and I die. Behold, the city is near enough for me to flee, and it is a little one. Let me escape there. Is it not a little one? And my life will be saved." And he said to him, "Behold, I grant you this favor also, that I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Escape there quickly, for I can do nothing till you arrive there." Therefore, the name of this city was called Zoar.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So beginning with verse 12, the angels say to Lot, "Have you anyone else here?" So they're not only concerned with the people in the household, but anyone that Lot might be related to, they want to save and bring out of the city. And of course, this includes Lot's sons-in-law. So his daughters are basically betrothed or engaged to be married to a couple guys in Sodom. Probably not a good deal for them anyway. And Lot then actually goes to their home to tell them they need to get out because the Lord's going to destroy the city. And how do they respond? They laugh. They think it's a joke. It's our word Isaac again, by the way. So this little theme of Isaacing is even carried into the Sodom and Gomorrah story. So clearly what we see evidence of here in this story is God's mercy and Lot's weakness. Because if it had not been for God's mercy, Lot and his family would have been destroyed. They physically have to grab Lot and his family by their hands and drag them out of the city to save them. And it says, the Lord being merciful to him, verse 16. So we see a lot of these Old Testament stories and we think, oh, that God in the Old Testament, he was so vengeful and full of wrath. He was always judging people, and destroying things. But when you read the stories in their context, you find really that the Lord has no choice but to bring judgment on wickedness when it's this severe. But even in the midst of judgment, he's always looking for how he can be gracious and how he can show mercy, because that's his heart. So we see that the angels are trying to hurry while Lot delays. In fact, we're told that Lot, let's see, what verse is it? Verse 16, and while he lingered. You can imagine when Lot went to the cities of the plain, he had a lot of stuff, didn't he? Remember, he had so much that he and Abraham could not dwell in the same land together. So here he is being told to flee the city. And it'd be like, if we had a hurricane or an earthquake or something about to happen and we knew it, what are we going to take? There's that moment of panic. Oh no, I've got all this stuff and what am I going to do? I can't lose it all. And that's probably what's happening here to Lot. It's hard to let go, even though he knows destruction is imminent. He's so tied into his things that he owns that he would have actually forfeited his life had the angels not grabbed him and his family and brought them out. So we have this language, as I mentioned, that the angels literally take him and his family by the hand to bring them out of the city. Now, what do the angels tell Lot to do? Where do they tell him to go?
Run for the hills.
Run for the hills, escape to the mountains. Okay. I don't know if you remember last night when we looked at the map of the Kekar, the Jordan Valley, and that little circular plain is right at the head of the Dead Sea, and on one side is the territory that belongs to Israel, and the other side is the area that ended up belonging to the country of Moab. And right above that plain, there are mountains on the other side. And so these are the mountains that the angels are telling Lot and his family to flee to. But what does Lot say? Sorry?
Because if you want to flee to another city.
Yeah, why would he rather flee to a city than to the mountains? Why does he say that? Sorry?
There's nothing in the mountains, like going to another city, seems easy.
Well, there's truth to that. There's nothing in the mountains where going to a city seems better, but that's not the reason he gives. Now, maybe that's a motive deeper down in his heart, but it's not what the text says. What reason does he give the angels for wanting to flee to a city instead of the mountains? Sorry? He can't be bothered going as far as the mountains, and why can't he be bothered? What does he think?
The disaster will overtake him.
He says the disaster will overtake me. Now that's pretty ironic. Here the angels are doing everything they can to save Lot, and they say flee to the mountains, and he's like, we'll never make it. I know you've been merciful to us, but we'll never make it. So can we just go to this city? And how do the angels respond when he asks that?
Very gracious.
Very gracious. They say go. And we won't destroy the city, or the Lord won't destroy the city. So here God actually spares an entire city that was meant to be destroyed simply because of the weakness of Lot, who says, I'll never make it to the mountains. Can I just go to this town? And God says, okay, go there. But I can't begin the destruction until you get there. So Lot argues that he can't escape to the mountains in time. So God spares the city of Zoar. And this is the name that the city receives because Lot calls it a little city. And again, in Hebrew, this word Zoar relates to the idea of being small or little. So as we've mentioned, Lot doesn't believe he will be, oh no, we haven't mentioned this yet. Once Lot gets to Zoar, what he ends up doing is fleeing to the mountains because he decides that the disaster is finally going to overtake this city and he can't stay there. So we see a great deal of instability in Lot. We can't fault him. This is a horrible disaster coming on the area. We might panic and react similarly. So in judging Lot, we might judge ourselves. But at the same time, we see that God's whole heart here is to save him. And yet he keeps thinking he's going to perish in this destruction. So there's no real trust that God will protect him and spare his life. Now, we don't actually see this point until we come to the following verses. So I want to go ahead and read some more of these verses. Let's pick up with verse 23, and let's read down to verse 29.
The sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. Then the Lord rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah, from the Lord out of the heavens. So he overthrew these cities, all the plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and what were on the ground. And his wife looked back behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord. Then he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land which went up like the smoke of the furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had dwelt.
Okay. So once Lot enters Zoar, the Lord begins to rain down the fire and the brimstone, it says, and he overthrows the cities. Unfortunately, Lot's wife doesn't make it, right? The angels had said, don't look back. And of course, we know the story, Lot's wife looks back. And the idea isn't like as you're running, you just kind of glance over your shoulder, but that she gazed. So she stopped, she turned around, and she gazed at the city. And that delay cost her her life. Why do you suppose she did that?
So maybe grieving the loss of a comfortable life that they had back in.
Probably, yeah. Thinking of, again, of everything that they had left behind. Their whole life was there. All of their possessions were there. As far as she was concerned, their future was there. She had sons-in-law who were going to marry her daughters, etc. And so it's almost too much for her. You know, she can't let go. And because she can't let go, she gets consumed in the destruction. So it's a really sad story. What will a man give in exchange for his own soul? You know, what if we gain the whole world but lose our own soul? Jesus says, and that's sadly what happens to Lot's wife here. She has a lot of possessions, and apparently they have a greater hold on her than even fleeing for her own life. One of the things that's emphasized in the story is the time of day. You notice when the angels came, the Lord and the angels came to Abraham, we're told it was in the heat of the day, right? And what time of day is it when the angels make it to Sodom? Okay, it's evening. And then Lot prepares a meal for them, and so the night comes. And what happens during the nighttime? You know what happens. All the bad stuff happens. Isn't that the way it usually is at night, right? Evil loves the nighttime because they believe their deeds can be hidden from view. So the nighttime is a dangerous time. So by giving these various indications of time through the story, we're being told certain things. Now, when does the judgment fall on these cities of the plain? Because we're told what time of day.
It was when the sun had risen on the earth.
When the sun had risen. Now, in the ancient world, oftentimes, if a person was to stand trial, it would happen in the early morning hours. And so that's what we have here. The Lord begins the judgment here in these early morning hours. Okay, so the scriptures frequently do this. If they tell us the time of day, there's a reason that we're being told that. And we'll pay attention to that as we continue through Genesis, because there's other places we're going to be told what time of day it is. So although it's literally that time of day, it's also a symbol communicating something to us. Okay. So we still haven't reached the verses where Lot decides he can't stay in the city, but we'll see those in a moment. But I do want to point out that when we get to verse 29, he's looked over the destruction, but we're told in verse 29 that God remembered Abraham. And what did he do when he remembered Abraham? He delivered Lot. He sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow. Okay, so we saw God remembering Noah and the flood then beginning to come to an end and recede. Here, God remembers Abraham. That is, he remembers the intercession of Abraham. And God is faithful to spare Lot and his daughters. Tried to spare others, tried to spare the sons-in-law, tried to spare the wife, but sadly, they got caught up in the destruction because they loved the city more. One of the key words used in the story, and we saw it frequently, is the word escape. And there's a little wordplay going on in Hebrew here. It's used 5 times. The Hebrew word for escape is malat. So you can hear in that the word Lot, the name Lot. So Lot is being told to malat over and over again. Escape, escape, escape. Okay. All right, so any other thoughts before we move to the next slide? Okay, let's go ahead and read verses 30 through 38, which tells us another one of these very sad stories.
Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old and there is no man around to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink wine and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." That night they got their father to drink wine, and that older daughter went in and slept with them. He was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. The next day, the older daughter said to the younger, "Last night I slept with my father. Let's get him to drink wine again, and you go in and sleep with him, so we can preserve our family line through our father." So they got their father to drink wine that night also, and the younger daughter went in and slept with him. Again, he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So both Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites today. The younger daughter also had a son. She named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites of today.
Okay, thank you. So this is one of those really icky, sordid stories in the book of Genesis, isn't it? Here's the verse we've been looking for where Lot was afraid to dwell in Zoar, and so he and his daughters dwelt in a cave. So they end up fleeing to the mountains anyway. But at least the people of Zoar can thank Lot that their city didn't get destroyed in the process. This is really sad when you think of all that Lot had when he was with Abraham. And now he's down to 2 daughters and living in a cave. That's all he's got left. It's very, very tragic. And I think the emphasis here is on the choices that Lot made and how those were poor choices. He chose by what he saw. You know, the area looked great to his eyes, and so he went for it. And then he became so attached to the area that it was hard for him to leave. And ultimately, he ends up losing everything except his own life and the life of his daughters. And then it seems as though his own daughters have become severely tainted by life in Sodom, to the point where they would consider committing incest with their father in order to carry on his family line. Now it says that there, verse 31, there is no man on the earth to come into us, as is the custom of all the earth. What do you think of that statement?
The custom of all the earth.
No, that there is no man in all the earth to come into us. Hmm? It's definitely not true, right? They just came from Zor. I'm sure there were men there in that little town, however little it was. But they're looking at this destruction as if it's so complete that they're the only ones left on earth, even though they know that can't possibly be true, having just come from this town that they were living in. But this is the excuse that the older daughter uses then for them to get their father drunk so that they can become pregnant by him. So they both follow through with this, and they both become impregnated by their father. And the name of the oldest daughter's son is Moab, verse 37. So we know of the country of Moab, right? We read about it later in Scripture. So the Moabites are descendants of Lot, okay, through this incestuous relationship he has with his daughters. The name Moab in Hebrew literally means from the father. So the name actually fits what happens, sadly. And then the younger daughter gives birth and names her son Ben-Ami, which means son of my people. So again, very similar. And it says that he is the father of Ammon to this day. So the Moabites and the Ammonites are descendants of Lot. And we'll meet them frequently throughout the pages of the Old Testament. So as bad as this story is, the reason Lot is saved is why? Because of Abraham. And the Lord remembered Abraham. Once again, we see Abraham being a blessing to the nations. Because Lot is saved, the nations of Moab and Ammon are birthed. So we've already seen now that God is a blessing to the Ishmaelites, and he is a blessing to the Moabites and the Ammonites. We'll continue to see other nations, as I've said, that God blesses because of their connection with Abram and his descendants. So when we look back at the bigger picture, we can say that Lot plays a counter role to Abraham with respect to land and seed. He ends up in a cave and descendants by incest, all because of his poor choice. Whereas Abraham ends up with the land of Canaan and a promised seed, Isaac. And wealth on top of that. So again, we said that these two chapters are a whole. They present this contrast between Abraham and Lot, and also then between their faiths. Now there's something else I want to do before we leave this story. I want to point out that this story is also typological, okay? It has many similarities with the story of the flood. And I'm going to show you what those are. You might want to jot these down. I think it could be on the midterm. I encourage you to, anytime I show a story that's typological and how it relates to another story, I encourage you to jot that down. And I believe that, I may have said this before, but just to reiterate it, the reason I believe the Bible does this is when you start seeing similarities between one story in the Bible and another, the Bible is saying, hey, go back and reread that story and see what's similar and see what's different, and then hear the message that God is communicating through that. So again, it's allowing Scripture to interpret Scripture. Okay, so first of all, here's one that you could only pick out in the Hebrew. In verse 16, there's actually a pun on the name of Noah. Here's where it is. I'll read you the whole verse. And while he lingered, the men took hold of his hand, his wife's hand, and the hands of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful to him. And the Lord brought him out, and here's our word, and set him, that is, rested him, knowed him, outside the city. Okay? Now, if that was all we have, we could say, well, that's an easy coincidence because the word Noah means to rest or to set. Okay? But there's a bunch of other similarities. This idea of finding grace in your eyes. We're told that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And Lot says, let me find grace in your eyes or favor in your sight. Let me go to this little city. After all, it's a small city. In both stories, the sin is described as being much. Now, here's one of the biggies. When God sends fire and brimstone upon the earth, it says that he rains it down. Same word used in the story of the flood for the rain. And also the word sulfur that is used is very similar to the word gopher in gopher wood. Okay, so it doesn't have the same meaning, but it sort of might be a word play there. Okay. In the story of the flood, we're told that the Lord shut the door of the ark. And in the story of Lot, the angels shut the door after they pull Lot back into the house. We've already noticed that both stories mention God remembering someone and then acting to bring deliverance. Okay, so the next point I'm going to make isn't 100% accurate, but you'll get the point. I'll explain it in a second. The cities are totally destroyed except for one man and some of his family members. Well, this is the perspective of the daughters. There's no man on earth to come into us. Okay, so in other words, everything's been destroyed. The only man left is our dad. So to preserve his line, we're going to have to get him drunk and have relations with him. So it does remind us of the story of the flood in the sense that truly everything was destroyed and there was only one man and his family left. And then finally, and this is an interesting one, following the destruction, there is a story about a father getting drunk and being uncovered before his children. Remember the story of Noah getting drunk, being uncovered in front of his son Ham. And sin resulting from that. And then, of course, here the daughters get their father drunk and have sexual relations with him. Some of these similarities only come by really meditating on the biblical story. Finding a good commentary where somebody's meditated well on the biblical story. Reading it in the original language if you can, and if you can't, getting a good commentary from a guy or a lady who reads it in the original language and can tell you what the original language says. In our English translations, we can miss some things simply because the translation can't communicate. Like the fact that Noah's name is being punned on in verse 16. There's no way that the English translation can catch that. You can only see that in the original language. But many of these other things you can see in the English translation. Okay, so that's interesting. So what do we learn from this comparison of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah being related so closely to the story of the flood? What are we being told?
God hasn't changed.
God hasn't changed.
And haven't changed.
Human beings haven't changed. And if this, if the sin of Sodom is being compared to the flood, and we know how wicked it was for the flood to come upon the earth, it's another way of emphasizing just how wicked the people of Sodom were. Okay, but God, again, he limits his judgment. He not only saves Lot and his daughters, but he spares this whole city of Zoar that deserved destruction, but he didn't destroy it. Any other thoughts? Okay. You just want to get out early. I know you guys. No, that's great. So yeah, we've reached our destination tonight. So we'll pick up tomorrow night with chapter 20 and do 20, 21, 22, and 23 for tomorrow night. Okay. All right. God bless you guys. Have a good night.